welcome, and thank you for joining us for the Social Science Symposium, The War on Ukraine, a forum discussion. So today we have two speakers here joining us. We have Dr. Doellinger. Did I say that right? Doellinger. In history. He is a professor of history here at WU. He has his PhD in Russian and East European history and teaches courses in this area as well. So maybe some of you have taken some of his classes. In the 90s, he closely followed Slovakia's path toward the EU and NATO membership and has worked as an election supervisor in Bosnia for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe after the war in 1997. Let's give him a welcome. And then he is joined by Dr. Eliot Dickinson, who's a professor of political science here at WU. And so many of you have probably also had a class or two with him. Dr. Dickinson earned his PhD in political science from Purdue University and teaches courses in comparative politics with an emphasis in peace studies and politics in South Africa, Austria, and Germany. His publications include a book, Globalization and Migration, A World in Motion, as well as a number of articles and book chapters on South African politics, Austrian politics, and German immigration policy. So let's give him a warm welcome also. And I will turn it over to them for the rest of the talk. Thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks for coming to this. Ellie and I threw this together pretty quickly last week. I think it was last Monday morning, coming off of the news of what was happening in the Ukraine. And this has just been a really traumatic 2 weeks. We're 13 days into this. Our plan is to each give a presentation. We're going to try to keep it short. There's a clock right there that I'm eyeing very carefully. And we really want to have time for discussion and questions. And so we're watching that closely, and we'll send each other's cues if we're starting to go a little too long. I'm reminded of a moment in my undergraduate life. It was November 1989, and I had an 8 o'clock geography class. And I remember kind of wandering into that class. I teach 8 o'clock now, so I understand the feeling of those students, or your eyes when you come into that classroom. And the professor he had this bounce to his feet. And I realized later on that he was an immigrant from Hungary who'd fled the revolution in 1956. But he pretty much threw up his hands. I think he had a syllabus actually threw into the air and said, okay, this changes everything. And we had a whole different class. And there was a jubilation to the end of the Cold War. And I think back and I'm envious of how excited he got to be. Because we're at a moment like that. I have a class in the spring. Post-war Germany, Cold War Germany. I have to redo that class. I'm going to redo the class because this is that kind of big turning point in understanding, security relations, the world order, and so trying to make sense of it and trying to keep up with the news as you all are. So we thought it would be important to have a discussion forum on this and try to make sense of what's going on. So it has been horrific. I mean, in 2 weeks, in the last 13 days, Putin has launched this invasion, this war. Against Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. And, there are concerns about, Ukraine joining EU, joining NATO that are talked about. Putin's argument that Ukraine doesn't exist or doesn't have a right to exist as a state or as a people has surfaced. And that's very frightening language to hear as well. There's a lot of fog of war going on right now as we try to watch the news and understand what is happening. And maybe in 3 weeks, we'll see things differently, or 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. But things, as we watch, this has not certainly gone according to Putin's plan. I mean, that's been clear. I think regardless of different accounts of what we're seeing, things are not going as anticipated. What that says about the Russian military, I'm not sure. Ukrainian resistance has been more extensive than I think anybody expected. The leadership of the Ukraine, oh my gosh, Zelensky. In preparing for this, I've learned a lot about the Ukrainian president. And I learned that in 2019, he ran his presidential campaign virtually through YouTube, through Facebook, social media, rather than in-person events. That's explaining a lot. in terms of what we're seeing. He's been very effective, Churchillian in terms of his speaking, but also the reaction of the world in terms of sanctions. I mean, it's astounding. I think the pace of and the public reaction in the world has far outpaced what I think any of the political leaders expected, and been pushing them further as well. I mean, Switzerland even has abandoned decades of neutrality to introduce its own sanctions against Russia. Even supporters of Putin, like the leader of Hungary, have backed away. I mean, to me, that's just astounding. I pay a lot more attention to Hungary than I have been paying to the Ukraine and Russia, and it's just astounding seeing him even back away. And I'm curious to see what happens with China. There seems to be some edging going on there as well. So Putin has denied the existence or history of Ukraine. There's a long history of Ukrainians, of Ukrainian culture, national identity. Began emerging in the middle of the 19th century. And Ukraine was, the area of the Ukrainian speakers are part of several empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. But a national movement did develop within that. And before the Bolshevik Revolution, but after the first February Revolution, there was the Declaration of Independence by the Ukraine. And so they were not created by the communists or the Bolsheviks. They kind of were created in reaction to efforts by the Bolsheviks to take over that territory. In my own teaching of the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, it is national movements, both within the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also the Ukraine, that play a significant role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, about a week after the Ukraine declared its independence, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Gorbachev gave that final speech in December. So there's a long history. So historians, we look at what are the key moments, what are the points, and that really matter. How do we approach this as a historian? And Eliot will be doing this as a political scientist, and I benefited from there's so many conversations going on right now amongst historians who study this history. So I'm benefiting from a lot of points that they've made, but I'm adding in my own elements. And what I have up here is a map of what we see as Cold War Europe. The countries in blue are the member states of NATO. The countries in red are the member states of the Warsaw Pact military alliance. The Soviet Union is the largest there to the right, but then there were satellite states that were not part of the Soviet Union, but were part of that Warsaw Pact alliance. And a key thing as a historian I want to emphasize is that what the Cold War was after 1945 was an acknowledgement of spheres of influence. Recognizing that, and this comes out of agreements between Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin in the negotiations and the strategizing during the war. And these spheres of influence were really respected. That professor I had as an undergraduate from Hungary, he had fled Hungary in 1956. Hungarians were fighting for freedom, democracy, challenging communist rule. They were certainly welcomed into the West as they made their way into Austria. And the United States and other Western countries, spoke out vehemently against what the Soviet Union was doing, but there was no intervention. They stood back. They acknowledged that sphere of influence. And a similar thing happened in 1968 with Czechoslovakia, in which a reform movement within Czechoslovakia was pursuing a reform of socialism, make it more humane, make it more democratic, to really pursue human dignity. And you can see Czechoslovakia there on the map, just east of West Germany. And the United States stayed out of that as well. So there was an acknowledgement of spheres of influence that were underway, and a non-intervention by the West acknowledging this. But then the Soviet Union collapsed, and it caught everybody by surprise. And what we start seeing then is expansion of both NATO and the European Union. Eliot's got a really good map, too, of NATO, and his highlights country names better than mine does. I was anticipating a big room. I thought it'd be easier to see green than words. And so all the countries in here are green, were part of that Soviet bloc, part of that Warsaw Pact element. And so we can see darker green countries joined in 1999, the lighter green joined in 2004, and there were several later. But we see a process of expansion of NATO into East Europe, both into countries that were part of Eastern Europe and separate from the Soviet Union, but also into countries that were part of the Soviet Union as well. And Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s was opposed to this, but it happened. It continued. I can talk more about negotiations that took place about that as well. The other image I'm going to go to here, this is then a picture of today of the various military alliances that do define Europe. And the countries in blue in this one are part of the NATO membership. The countries in red are part of the new security organization created by Russia, led by Russia. And it's the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And in purple here, this map highlights Ukraine. We see Ukraine really between these two areas. So Russian policy. How does understanding recent Russian history and policy help us understand what's going on within the Ukraine? We've seen through NATO and EU expansion a movement into what had been that Russian, no longer Soviet, but that Russian sphere of influence. What's been happening in the last 2 decades, Putin became president of Russia in 2000, just before Y2K, right? We're all waiting for the world to collapse from computer problems, and Yeltsin chose to resign. He had 2% approval rating and turned over power to Vladimir Putin, a former KGB general. In the 1990s, Russia was really too weakened to really be addressing issues, and we have this expansion of Europe eastward. But what's been going on within Russia and under Putin has certainly been a consolidation of authority within Russia, strengthening authoritarian autocratic rule, and that's been underway since the early 2000s. But also there have been efforts to reclaim some of these spheres of influence as well. If you look to the right there, there's a purple area just east of the Black Sea. That's Georgia, the country of Georgia. And in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, supporting 2 separatist areas there. And so there was a war in Georgia in 2000, reclaiming this area. And it made headlines, but there's largely no reaction from the world. I mean, this was accepted as a done deal in a lot of ways. And then thinking about the Ukraine, what's going on with the Ukraine. So I said in the beginning, the war began 13 days ago. It really began about 8 years ago. And thinking about what's been happening within the Ukraine itself and how that helps us understand the Ukrainian response. This is going to be the last point I'm really going to be making here. Ukraine in the 90s and early 2000s had been pursuing both NATO and EU membership. In 2004, there was a revolution in the Ukraine. And it was a revolution against a election fraud, corruption, authoritarian rule. The electoral results came in and there was fraud in the numbers. And so there was actually a revote. And in that revote, a pro-Western president was elected. Now the pro-Russian president, the same president involved in electoral, or the candidate involved in electoral fraud back in 2004, ran again in 2010. His name was Viktor Yanukovych. And he won the election. He got over 50% of the vote, conveying the sense of some of the divisions within Ukraine itself. And the country had been moving towards both NATO and EU membership. There was actually an accession agreement worked out. And Yanukovych delayed several years in signing this agreement. And then in 2013, his final refusal to sign it really led the parliament, which had supported it, and led to larger protests within the Ukraine. And particularly in a square, it's called Maidan, M-A-I-D-A-N. You'll see it up here on this slide. And the protest and the revolution that emerges becomes known as the revolution of dignity, which will force Yanukovych out of power. He fled to the east, made his way ultimately to Russia, but he also asked for Russian help against what he saw as an improper removal of political power. Separatists in eastern Ukraine, supported by Russian troops without markings, claimed territory in the east. Putin then seized control of the Crimean Peninsula, which was then annexed into Russia. And fighting's really been going on in the Ukraine since 2014 in this eastern area. So this is going to be the final point I want to kind of highlight in terms of talking about the historical background to this. The Orange Revolution and this events going on in 2014, the Maidan protest, are transformative, I think, for Ukrainians in recognizing or asserting Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian independence, but also a civic activism that was reflected in both of these events. The role of civil society and engagement and a rejection of autocratic authoritarian rule. And that has shaped Ukrainian politics since 2014. a willingness to stand up and speak out and challenge autocratic rule. Zelensky was elected in 2019, the current president, and he's had that commitment towards working towards EU accession, NATO, but also these elements of rejection of corruption, authoritarian, autocratic rule. I think it's because of these events, there's a transformation that went on amongst Ukrainians, this idea of engaging and fighting for dignity and for human rights and for democratic rule. This is what we're seeing, both in Zelensky and I think amongst the Ukrainian population as well, in terms of shaping their response. And I saw a historian speaking on Friday who said that because of that, they're going to fight to the end. And well, who knows how accurate that actually is, but I think it conveys a sense of the reaction that's been going on. So that assertion of civic values and focus on human dignity. And I've got other slides up here to turn to later, but I want to turn over to my colleague Eliot, and then so I'm going to turn over to you right now, Eliot.
Okay,
right?
Could you pull up
and I'll pull
slides?
yours up here as well, yeah.
Okay, thanks, David. It's always hard to give a talk like this when there's a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding as we speak. There's, millions of people literally who are on the move, and there's thousands of people probably dying already, and this is all happening as we speak. So I don't know, it creates a somber mood and a moment of reflection about all the trauma that's going on. But I suppose we could start with asking what Putin really wants. And, that's a good question because nobody thought he was really quite crazy enough to go through with this. Maybe people thought that he would take the Donbass region and that was it. But no, he went with a full-fledged invasion of the country. So what does he want? Well, he wants to take the Ukraine, and he wants to restore imperial Russian power. And he wants to hold NATO at bay. And he wants to prevent the Ukraine from joining the European Union. But this has caused, of course, a massive humanitarian disaster. And the headlines of the New York Times this morning was 2 million refugees have already left the Ukraine, and more are on the way. And I don't know how many people have died, but the estimates are probably in the low thousands at this point, although I don't know, and nobody knows, and I guess we'll see over time. But just to humanize what's happening, here are some pictures from today's newspaper of people fleeing the Ukraine, and as you can see, it's mostly women and children. Just an amazing statistic that I heard today was that of the 2 million refugees that have left, half are children. And amazingly, too, today's International Women's Day. So, it's time to honor our women and our wives and our mothers and our sisters and so on. But all these women refugees are fleeing to Western Europe. So where have they gone? This again is from today, the 8th of March. The source is the High Commissioner for Refugees. And as you can see, Poland has taken in the lion's share, but they've gone basically to every country they can get to. Kind of boggles the mind. I mean, I slept well last night, and I had a nice warm bed. And I woke up to a nice cup of coffee and had a restful morning, and I came to my nice office on a beautiful campus, and it's just so worlds away from fleeing and jumping in a car and leaving your home behind and getting bombed out and arriving in another country where you may or may not be wanted, or you may or may not have a bed. But this is truly the main point here, is that it's a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding as we speak and as we have this nice academic discussion. Such an irony. But the other thing is, we face a few big threats in the world, and one is nuclear war and nuclear weapons and kind of the nuclear problem in general. And there's been a lot of saber rattling, of course, over these last few weeks. And incredibly, Putin put Russia's nuclear forces on high alert. I mean, they're always on high alert. The United States and Russia, we can launch nuclear weapons within minutes, so we're always on high alert. But he put it to another level, which is all the more bizarre that he would threaten anything like that, anything remotely close to it. And I'm just happy that we have someone who's sane in office like Joe Biden, who is not escalating this. In fact, he's doing the opposite. He's de-escalating it in whatever ways he can. So I'm happy about that. But this is just outrageous and crazy that Putin would even mention a nuclear war or using nuclear weapons of any sort. So there's that. And then there's the story about how the Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons back in 1994 after 3 years of negotiating. I'm for nuclear disarmament. I think that was the right thing. I think fewer nukes are better. But it does raise this question of, well, what if they still had nukes? Would that have deterred this invasion now? And that's a hypothetical that it's kind of hard to answer. It's possible. But the other big danger right now, of course, is all of these nuclear power plants. This is the Zaporizhia plant, and as it says here, more than half of Ukraine's energy comes from nuclear power. And use your imagination. What if? What if a bomb went off? What if an errant missile, hit one of these nuclear power plants? What if the fire broke out and took over, like there was a fire at this plant? What if they couldn't put it out? You'd have another Chernobyl times 10. What if the workers who work there and keep this place from melting down, what if they just couldn't go to work? And what if they just left? I don't know. I mean, these are disaster scenarios that are, possibly closer than we think. So those are the real dangers. And that's why this entire situation here, this entire war, is just absolutely crazy. It's why we need de-escalation and why we need peace. Of course, there's a big energy question. 30% of Europe's liquefied natural gas comes from Russia. So there's this question, like the German chancellor last night, he said, the reason why we're not cutting off gas is because we'll go cold in the winter. And I think we all face that question. My home here in Monmouth is heated by natural gas, and I was happy to see a little fire glowing in the morning when I woke up, and I was happy for the warmth that I woke up to. And I'm also happy, not that I drive a lot, but I'm also happy to pay only $4 a gallon. There might be some people talking tough out there about let's cut off all of our oil imports and so on. Yeah, are you ready to pay $6 a gallon for gas or more, $8? I don't know. I guess we'll see in the coming months and maybe weeks about what this all means for energy prices. There's a lot of talk about the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, and that Nord Stream pipeline is the topmost line that you see running from Russia down through the Baltic Sea to Germany there. So that's another complicating matter. I mean, it's not exactly possible, I think, to cut off the energy source of Europe just overnight. You could, but there'd be some pretty serious consequences. We all know about the sanctions that have been put on Russia. I think that these sanctions are probably going to cripple Russia. It's going to cripple the economy. It's going to be absolutely devastating. Already, we all know what's happened. The ruble has crashed. The stock market has tanked. It's going to be absolutely devastating, I think, for the Russian economy in the short term and the long term, especially over the coming months. As usual, it's going to be the poor people that suffer. These oligarchs who have looted Russia for decades and taken and stolen and hoarded all of these billions of dollars and stashed it in offshore bank accounts and just brazenly stolen and taken and ruined Russia. They're probably not going to be hurt so much. Their total wealth might go from 50 to 20 billion, but they'll still be okay. It's not going to hurt that bad. It's going to be the average people, the ordinary people who are going to suffer, as usual. So I think that Putin has badly miscalculated. I think that these sanctions are going to hurt really bad. And already we're seeing the consequences. I mean, even, there are no flights to Europe anymore. Like I said, the ruble has tanked. Inflation has gone up. Salaries have gone down. It's probably a type of economic pain that you and I as much as we have our own economic concerns and our own pain, it's on a different level. And I'm just thankful that it hasn't happened to us yet, and I hope it doesn't in the future. So as far as overall consequences of all of this, I think Putin's badly miscalculated. I think that it's going to lead to a long-term suffering of the Russian people. I wonder if there's a new kind of authoritarian axis that's formed between Moscow and Beijing. I think that it's probably backfired on him in a big way. In fact, it's rather unified NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance Organization. It's unified the European Union. It's isolated Russia on the global stage. It's raised all sorts of other questions. In fact, there are probably more questions now than there are answers, but it does make you wonder if there's now some type of authoritarian axis between Putin and Xi Jinping. Makes you wonder if Xi Jinping is going to use this fog of war to take over Taiwan. It makes you think about the U.S. invasion of Iraq 20 years ago. We started a war of aggression that was unnecessary, unprovoked even, against Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with 9/11. It took us 3 weeks to get to Baghdad and take that city. So we're 2 weeks into this war, so just give it some time, they'll probably do it. The United States and Great Britain and the other allies, we probably killed hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq. We destroyed Baghdad. And Baghdad was the site of the ancient biblical Garden of Eden, and all those priceless treasures that were there just ruined. And it cost us trillions of dollars and a decade of war. And it came at our expense. Taxpayer dollars went to that, just pissed right down the drain. A decade of war, lots of death, millions of refugees. So I think it's a moment for us to reflect on what our foreign policy has done. It's easy to be all self-righteous now, point the finger how evil Putin is. But I think a lot of people who are saying that were pretty gung-ho for war about 20 years ago. So, yeah, it raises lots of other questions. I suppose the biggest thing is, well, how is this going to end? Nobody knows. Putin could get overthrown. The Russian people could suffer so much that they'll take him out. And then what? I don't know. I mean, there probably aren't a bunch of Thomas Jeffersons waiting to take over Russia right now. But you never know. There might be a democratization that follows. It might teach the West that we ought to be more energy independent. Maybe we'll have a green revolution from here on out when we realize we shouldn't be so dependent on Russian natural gas. So, who here is for a green revolution? Are you with me? And now, So maybe something good will come of it. Maybe not. Maybe this war will drag on for months and for years, George W. said, this war is going to last 6 weeks in Iraq. It's going to cost $20 billion. That was the original estimate of the cost of the war in Iraq. It cost trillions. It lasted a decade. And I'm not even talking about Afghanistan. So it could drag out. It could take a long time. Nobody knows. I don't know. Maybe there'll be a compromise, a peace deal. Maybe there'll be a deal, a dirty deal. Maybe Russia will agree to withdraw its troops, but on certain conditions. Maybe they'll withdraw their troops, 200,000 plus now, on the condition that they get the Donbass region, on the condition that Ukraine promises not to join NATO or the EU, on the condition that the West lifts sanctions. That might work. It might bring peace. It'd be, like I said, a pretty dirty deal. But it might work, and it'd probably be preferable to years of war and lots of civilian casualties in an absolutely destroyed country. So on that happy note, I'll just open it up to questions because I know there's a lot, and we've got about 15 minutes to ask questions still.
I was just thinking through my head. I'm older than most people here. I remember when I was a kid in civil defense drills, where little kids, we had to get under our desk and get prepared for intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were on our way. We get under our desk, and the teacher would run around opening up all the windows. I never quite understood that. Flying glass, I suppose, or hiding under your desk would save you from a thermonuclear blast was a little naive, but nonetheless, I remember that, and that's one of the reasons, I think David alluded to this, that we were so happy. Most of us were so happy, that especially older people, when Glasnost and Perestroika came along, and we thought, finally the end of a Cold War, end of nuclear threats, and that maybe we could come together and so on, and just comment, if you would, on just I've never been clear to me why Gorbachev and all of that failed, okay, and why the Russians allowed, frankly, a Stalinist KGB general to take command eventually of this country instead of following, let's say, the initiative of Gorbachev, and have a million other questions, but I'll leave it there.
I can take the Gorbachev one. I'll use this mic since that one's moving around. I mean, Gorbachev opened up and he recognized the system didn't work. He wasn't trying to remove communism. He was trying to do what Dubček was doing back in '68 in Czechoslovakia. Make socialism with the human face. Remove the abuses of power, the corruption, get people excited about building a new society in some way. And Glasnost, this new openness, getting people to talk about problems, that was exciting. But it also opened up an exposure or create space also for the different nationalisms that had been really being Russified in a lot of ways to really be expressing themselves. And Gorbachev wasn't planning for the Soviet Union to collapse. I mean, he lost control of what he created. And the 90s under Yeltsin, I mentioned his 2% approval rating. I mean, in his final weeks, and that's probably been generous for him. I mean, he was opening everything up and trying to pursue, I think from my view, really pursue a different type of democratic society, but really lost control in a different way, with abuses of power, corruption, gangs, violence, crime, and there was a desire, I think, for a strong leader. And I've never quite understood why Putin was the acting prime minister, so he was next in line when Yeltsin chose to resign, so he was able to move into that role. I've always wondered if there was something else going on there because it caught all of us by surprise when Yeltsin resigned. Because Putin, you're right, he was a KGB, but also very early on authoritarian, and we see that. It removed, governors within 2 years went from being elected to being appointed by the president, and then changing the laws, changing the Constitution, asserting his authority. So. And I think there was an acceptance of that because of the security that Putin brought. I mean, that's a big part of this. Why is Russia the way it is today in terms of, we're seeing protests, and the people who are protesting are going to pay a high price for that. I mean, the numbers are bigger than other protests, but, people who are challenged. Russia did not have its Orange Revolution or its Velvet Revolution or its revolution of dignity in the way the Ukrainians did. I think that's. And maybe they'll have that. Who knows? I mean, it could come out of this. So,
do you think that part of this is Putin's trying to gain major access to the Black Sea because he's going to need that water for future endeavors, including his oil and gas and everything?
Well, he's already annexed the Crimean Peninsula, so he has that access to the Black Sea. Visiting a middle school on Friday, and the teacher that had this reading, I'm going to assign this to the class, and it was about oil, possibility of oil in the Black Sea, and what increased access, additional territory would mean in terms of having access to that. So that could be, but he's already annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and so has that. So that's a good question. I don't know more than that. Do you have any?
Well, I did want to say something earlier that food prices probably are going to go up because grain exports, mostly wheat, coming out of the Ukraine, the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, it's going to be affected. And I don't know what exactly the repercussions of that are going to be, but it could be pretty severe, because when people get hungry, they get desperate. And so we might see food prices go up in addition to oil prices, as we've seen, and energy prices. That shouldn't be overlooked. Yeah.
And the Crimea Peninsula does not have good access to water. The Ukrainians supplied it with a massive water pipeline that would bring water in. And once the territory was annexed, the Ukrainians cut that off. And so there is going to be a water crisis in the Crimean Peninsula. I mean, particularly climate change and drought and changing environment.
So the answer to your question is yes. That's why he did it. Yeah, he wants control of that area and all the resources there.
I've heard a lot about Estonia and the Baltic states being concerned that this could expand.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a possibility in case Ukraine were to fall?
Yeah, I'm concerned by that, because where does it stop? I mean, if the goal is to reclaim that sphere of influence, well, what does that leave? Moldova, right here, and then those republics that are now part of NATO as well. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So yeah, where does it end? I mean, that would be the question. And then there's the Caucasus, Georgia over here to the southeast. So if that's the plan, and it's, this is all crazy, but I mean, if that's the plan, I mean, that's going to be catastrophic in terms of what that does. And those are NATO countries. I mean, how Putin views NATO is not intervening, because there's the fear of how this could expand in terms of being a larger nuclear war with, but it'd be so easy for this to expand. I mean, we're just on the edge, given the lines of where these NATO member countries are.
Yeah, I think the question of Finland is an interesting one. This map shows clearly that it's not part of NATO, and that's why they're afraid right now, and that's why they're now talking about joining NATO. It would make sense, wouldn't it?
Sweden too.
It's in Sweden. Yeah. But when it comes to Scandinavia, suddenly everyone gets really sensitive. We're talking about Scandinavians. Could never have let anything happen to them. And that brings up this larger question of European racism, which is rampant in our own society as well. We care very much when Europeans are being bombed and threatened and turned into refugees, but as we speak, 1 million or more Afghans are going absolutely hungry. 1 million Afghans have fled to neighboring Iran. That's not to mention the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, or take your pick of half dozen countries in Africa right now. When it's maybe a Middle Easterner or an African, we tend to maybe not to see so much about it on the news. But when it's a Ukrainian refugee, a child, like I showed at the beginning, it humanizes it on a different level, and we're holding forums like this and talking about it, when we really ought to be talking too about starvation in Afghanistan.
This question's for you, Eliot. 2 million has got to be an underestimate of what the massive humanity that's moving out of the Ukraine area. Your chart showed a group heading up to Russia, and then you've got 99,000 there, and you've got all these others going out. What's your sense of the ability for these countries to? What's going to happen?
Oh, I'm sure they're overwhelmed, and all I know is what I read in the newspaper too, and I've just seen pictures of cities in Poland that are just overwhelmed, and gyms that have been opened up and they put cots in there, and I think they're just totally maxed out, and that's what happens when you have a refugee crisis like this. And how many millions are internally displaced? There's no figure for that. But yeah, it kind of boggles the mind, the scale, the enormity of so many people on the move. And I don't know what to say other than I'm somewhat familiar with the refugee crises that have happened in Europe in recent years. And in Germany, they've been experiencing a refugee crisis for many years. And there were times when there just was no physical space to put another refugee. And they had to open up schools, they had to open up gymnasiums, they had to beg people to open up their homes, and there was no space left. And I'm assuming that that's happening now.
I was last updated on the Chernobyl reactor about a week ago, and they had just completed their 10th in a row maintenance shift with no backup crew. They're on skeleton crew. I was curious if either of you had heard any updates about
Chernobyl? Or do you mean the Zaporizhzhia plant? Are you talking about Chernobyl or the other nuclear power plants?
No, just the service and maintenance crew that's keeping it in its current state.
Chernobyl melted down in 1986, right?
But there were efforts to, Russian troops were moving on Chernobyl as well.
Right, but I mean, it doesn't need a lot of upkeep now, does it?
It's a good question.
I think it's just a disaster zone, and nobody lives there anymore because everything's contaminated. But the bigger question are these other plants. What if they got hit? What if they broke out in flames? What if the crew couldn't work there? Then we'd really have a much, much bigger nuclear disaster.
But Chernobyl does have active radiation. I mean, it's been encased in this new sarcophagus they put over. So if something were to strike that, I mean, if there were to, that would be on the scale of what you were describing with the other plants as well.
Right,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have just a bunch of kind of bad options here. You know, it's like the choices here are what's the least bad option?
We're hearing a lot about like the Russian government and their decisions and what's happening with them, but have we heard about how the Russian population as a whole feels about the situation? I mean, do we get a sense of that?
Well, again, I only know what I hear on the news. And so, yeah, there's been a huge crackdown in Russia. There's no free press, no freedom of speech. If you do, you know, those brave people that have gone out and protested are getting hauled off and beaten. I mean, those are some powerful images that I saw, truly beaten with batons by, 10 policemen grabbing one person and manhandling them. God only knows what happens when they get down to the police station. But then I heard a public television NewsHour report last night where apparently the restaurants are full. Apparently people this is in Russia, like in Moscow, they're going about their daily lives. There's a lot of misinformation. A lot of them don't know what to believe. It's kind of like we're watching Fox News here, and we don't know what we're talking about or listening to. Or a lot of misinformation. We're listening to Trump, who thinks Putin's a genius. They have a lot of misinformation too. And even some Russians apparently think it's a good idea to invade the Ukraine. That's what I've heard. So it's a mixed bag, and I'm not entirely sure, actually. I'm not there on the ground.
Yeah. There was a New York Times article about this. And what do you see if you're living in Russia watching the news? And it's an alternate reality. And just Friday, Putin introduced a new law outlawing actually the use of the word war or invasion, or presenting anything that's contradictory to the official message. So that's why New York Times is pulling out, Radio Free Europe, they're pulling out of Russia. It's a 15-year prison sentence for providing misinformation that challenges the official narrative. That's
like
powerful.
Stalin era.
Yeah. That's more than Stalin. I mean, I don't think they were that efficient, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Has a nuclear power plant been involved in a military struggle before?
Oh, it's been a long time. You have to go back. I mean, you can make your way back through history to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the last times we had such a saber rattling over nuclear power. In 1969, there was a border skirmish between Russia and China. In the Middle East, in the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis had nuclear weapons. Our President Trump talked about fire and fury when he was threatening North Korea, I mean, stupidly. So there are some precedents for this, but you really have to think hard. So I think the answer is when it comes to nuclear power plants, no. I can't think of really any. Yeah. So it's pretty rare. It's unprecedented.
I just want to say so I have a question and a comment. A comment is, I am myself a Ukrainian and I have family there, and I just want to say thank you for doing this discussion. It means a lot to us. And my question to you is, with a lot of news and a lot of uncertain propaganda coming from Russia, how does an average, American citizen, how are they able to, or do you know how would one distinguish what is more true or what is more not true? Yeah.
That's really hard. I mean, this has shaped our own world, right, in the last year, before this conflict. And how do we weigh information? How do we understand information? And, I think in the United States, we have multiple sources of information. I mean, there's that access. And I think the contrast within Russia is that it's very narrow. I mean, there's only now the officially approved. And that's a hard thing to overcome. That article about the media I was reading was talking about a Russian who was on a bus talking to a family member they had in the Ukraine, I think in Kharkiv. and they were under fire. And this phone conversation was happening on a Russian bus, and she turned up the volume, and the entire bus got quiet of Russians listening to what was happening, and the sirens, the screams, the explosions in the background. And, that happened. So that's a way. And so I think it's going to be interesting. We're going to see new ways of information being shared. The BBC is beginning its shortwave service into Russia as of, I think, yesterday. They haven't done this in decades. I mean, and that's a way of overcoming that. Radio Free Europe was a key source of information during the Cold War, of broadcasting uncensored news and information from Munich into all the Soviet bloc countries, into Soviet Union itself. But it takes an audience, right, though, that's willing to turn to that dial or find that station or be able to accept that. And that's what we see with our own challenges in the United States in terms of news gathering. And there are parallel realities in our own world in terms of understanding what happened January 6th and what happened, and so it's overcoming those difficulties.
Yeah. Well, I would say that in closing, this entire tragedy is a great distraction from really other more important issues. Last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out, and what it said, among other things, it's 3,000 pages long, but it said that the climate is changing faster than we can adapt, and we're heading towards some real catastrophes ahead. There's that. There's the fact that we need a green revolution now and quick. We need to concentrate on human rights and democracy. And I'm reminded of Dwight Eisenhower, who said that every rocket that's fired, every warship that's launched, signifies in the end a theft from those who are hungry. And that is the real tragedy of all of this. It's wasted money on bombs instead of food. So with that, thank you for coming. Thanks for your interest, and we can talk later.
Thank you.